Okay, we're continuing our saga here. Um, we're in the midst of reviewing the book, The Psychology of Quality of Life, Hedonic Well-Being, Life Satisfaction, and Eudaimonia. This is a book which is published by Sprague. I'm the author of the book, and we are essentially discussing parts of the book. We are already discussed uh, the ones that are not highlighted in this slide: philosophical foundations, definitions and measures, consequences of happiness, objective reality and its effects on happiness, subjective reality and its effect on happiness, life domains and their effects on happiness. So all of these are different parts of the book, and we discussed those in previous modules. And now what we're doing is we're concentrating on the last module, which is population segments and happiness. And and looking at that slide, you can tell that the book covers quite a bit of topics, different topics related to different population segments: children, youth, college students, elderly, women, disabled, drug addicts, teachers, immigrants, caregivers, and so forth. Um, but what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on women and quality of life. We're not going to be talking much about the others. These are covered in the book, um, and and there's only sparse research in relation to the disabled, drug addicts, teachers, and so forth. So we will not devote much time and attention, but these studies are already covered in the book. Okay, so let's focus on women because, again, the research on women and quality of life um, is um, is quite extensive, and we need to talk about those. And some of it is actually controversial, so it's from that perspective, it's exciting. um, the things that we're going to be talking about is what is happiness for women, explaining happiness, explaining women's happiness and the factors affecting women's happiness. So let's start out with the first one, which is what is happiness for women? What's how quality of life and well-being researchers have conceptualized happiness for this particular population? And the answer is, well, um, yeah, the vast majority of quality of life researchers and well-being researchers that have looked at women exclusively and actually looked at gender differences, um, have kind of focused on affect intensity and more specifically hedonic well-being. So essentially the what you might call the affective or the most micro um, conception of well-being. They Yeah. So, and the reason being, and the reason for this, as you will tell when we get to the different explanations, is because much of the research showed that there is a pronounced difference between men and women in terms of subjective well-being, and specifically in relation to affect intensity, and that is women tend to experience higher level of positive affect, and also they experience higher levels of negative affect. So, in terms of affective and affect intensity, they tend to register higher levels of affect intensity, both positive and negative, compared to men. So keep in mind this particular finding that seems to be quite robust in much of the research. That again, the level of intensity, affect intensity, is much higher for women in terms of both positive and negative than for men. Okay, well, let's get into some of the explanations related to this particular finding. Uh, and as you can see, we've got all kinds of explanations, all kinds of theories focusing on why women tend to experience higher levels of affect, both positive and negative, than men. There's a biological explanation, there's a psychological explanation, a cultural explanation, a psychographic explanation, a healthcare explanation, a socioeconomic explanation, and a social role explanation. Let's start out with the biological explanation. In the biological explanation, much of the research focuses on negative affect. Why do women experience more negative affect than men? And this may be related to their constitutional predispositions to certain emotional disorders, well, according to that theory. Women women suffer exclusively from disorders specifically related to their particular reproductive role and aspects related to pregnancy and birth, such as menstrual cycle disorders, hysterectomy, breast and cervical cancer. For example, there is evidence suggesting that when exposed to stressors, women's heart rate increases significantly higher than men. In contrast, men experience greater systolic blood pressure reactions. Men and women also differ in neuroendocrine reactions to stress. Women's immune system seems to be more severely affected by stress than men. That's again a finding that seems to at least gaining a certain degree of um, popularity. By the same token, women compared to men tend to experience decreased epinephrine levels during positive social interactions. Women also um, tend to experience, they tend to be much more emotionally expressive through facial expressions than men. In some, women and men seem to vary in their pattern of biological reaction to stress signals and positive stimuli. And this constitutional difference may account for variation in positive and negative emotions. Ah, well, that's the biological explanation. How about the psychological explanation? Well, the psychological explanation again focuses still on negative emotions, and it focuses, well, it's essentially what clinical psychologists talk about in terms of rumination theory. And rumination theory, argues that women respond to pre-depressive events that may account for gender differences in clinical depression. When confronted with a negative event, women tend to ruminate about the negative event much more so than men. Men, on the other hand, what they do is they tend to distract themselves by doing things when they are not in a good mood. Women tend to focus their attention on the negative event. Doing so increases the likelihood of onset onset of clinical depression. Of course, this psychological explanation applies to negative affect. It does not explain why women experience more positive affect than men. Okay, how about the cultural explanation? Well, the cultural explanation is that women in contemporary society are expected to play several social roles that are often conflicting. For example, the role of the wife, the mother, the caretaker, the worker. And this conflict takes an emotional toll on women. Also, another aspect, another dimension of the cultural exploitation is that women are discriminated against in many situations, such as the workplace. Such discrimination takes an emotional toll on women by creating undue stress and anxiety. Consider society's maltreatment of unmarried women, battered women, childless women, divorced women, elderly women, and even women who have success successful careers and aspire to climb up the ladder. In other words, the experience of higher levels of psychopathology among women may be due to women's experience of of oppression due to sexism. So sexism is a what you might call a cultural explanation. There's still another um, cultural explanation that is grounded in what sociologists call objective objectification theory. Objectification theory. This theory uh, again posits that women are socialized and are socialized in a way that they become sexual objects, and this type of objectification causes mental health problems such as eating disorders, depression, and sexual dysfunction. Sexual objectification experiences uh, socialize women to treat themselves as objects to be admired as an object of beauty. Self objectification is manifested by the habitual monitoring of the body appearance. Thus, thus manifest body surveillance needs to promote body shame and anxiety. Body shame occurs when the person compares oneself against a cultural standard of beauty and perceives oneself as failing to meet that standard. Anxiety is also experienced when the person anticipates fear when one's body is evaluated. This chain of events ultimately contributes to women's risk for depression, sexual dysfunction, and eating disorders. Of course, these cultural explanations are designed to explain women's psychopathology. They do not explain why women experience greater positive emotion than men. Okay, let's move on to discussing the psychographic explanation. And and here what we're doing is we're focusing on women's lifestyle. And the focus is that when women get divorced and become a single parent household, this lifestyle transition is very stressful. Taking care of the family financially and in every other way can induce a great deal of stress on women. And this stress leads to ill being. Um, Again, this explanation does not stand on its own. Implicit in this explanation is that women who experience lifestyle changes tend to experience greater stress than men because these lifestyle changes, such as divorce, death of a husband, tend to produce financial hardships. And the financial hardship may account for the fact that women tend to experience higher levels of negative emotions than men. Again, this explanation applies to the incidence of negative emotion among women, and it doesn't say much about the incidence of positive emotion. How about the healthcare explanation? Okay, the healthcare explanation. Women report high levels of psychopathology, perhaps because they are more socially inclined to use the healthcare system, much more so than men. The social norm is that it is socially acceptable for women to seek health care, but less so for men. Therefore, if women feel distressed, they seek assistance from their physician in the form of tranquilizers, antidepressants, and other forms of psychiatric drugs. Men are less likely to do so. When women feel distressed, they may vent out their anger in the form of aggression. rather than seek help from healthcare professionals. Again, this explanation focuses on negative emotions only. It does not address positive emotions. How about socioeconomic? The socioeconomic explanation. Women may experience a higher level of psychopathology than men because they are more socially disadvantaged than men. Much evidence points to the fact that socioeconomic status is a strong predictor of health, especially mental health. Women tend to have less economic resources than men. Whatever resources that they may have are controlled by men, especially in the less developed countries. As such, their lower socioeconomic status may be a cause of stress and anxiety that ultimately translates to ill being. The focus of this explanation is again on negative emotion. It does not address positive emotion. The last explanation is a social role explanation. And here what's the argument is as follows. Men and women tend to assume different roles in society. One of the most important roles that women assume is the caretaker role, such as nurses, teachers, social workers. Within the home, women are more likely to be involved with childcare. Similarly, women tend to assume the caretaking role with the elderly. The caretaking role socializes women to experience a higher degree of positive emotions, and one can say also negative emotions. Um, Positive emotions are necessary in establishing and maintaining relationship with others. Therefore, sensitivity to others' emotional states and reacting with positive emotion of one's own are skills inherent in the caretaking role. Positive emotions such as happiness serve to facilitate relationship formation and maintenance by maintaining the caretaker attractive by making the caretaker attractive to the caretaker recipient. Positive emotions serve to enhance intimacy and trust, which are essential in maintaining social relationships. On the other hand, we can also talk about the fact that caretaking is a very stressful, can be very stressful in many situations, and can generate quite a bit of stress. And therefore, women, because of their caretaking role, tend to experience, again, a higher degree of negative emotions than men. Okay, so that sort of gives you a whole bunch of explanations of why women tend to experience higher levels of positive as well as negative affect than men. Let's now look at the factors affecting happiness of women, and they are family and cultural factors, economic and work-related factors, residential factors, and the then we have sexual and relationship factors and health-related factors. Well, let's start out with the family and cultural factors. What what does the research tell us about this? Well, focusing on pregnancy and postpartum, much of the research showed that both positive and negative affect uh, peak during pregnancy and immediately postpartum, especially for first-time mothers. Now, that's something to do of course, with the hormones. It makes again women very receptive to um, positive and to the experience of positive and negative emotions, much more so than men. How about transition to parenthood? The transition of parenthood, again, based on the research, there's not a significant difference between men and women um, in terms of being parents and transitioning into parenthood. So again, There's nothing, there's no significant difference between men and women. How about being a parent versus being childless? Again, women who are parents compared to women who are childless tend to experience higher levels of positive as well as negative emotions. Um, how about abuse? Abuse. Again, the research indicates that women who left their abusive husbands or partners recorded better vitality, mental health, and social well being. However, the quality of life scores of women who suffered a high level of abuse did not change much, underscoring the traumatic long term effects of abuse. So, abuse depends on what kind of abuse. If it's long-term abuse, then again it takes a huge toll, and it's um, and separation is not likely to change women's happy level of happiness. There's another there's another factor which is called communalism, and that is that it's a cultural orientation emphasizing interdependence. And much of the research shows that women who score highly on communalism, um, tend to also score highly on measures of happiness. Moving right along to discussing economic and work-related factors, satisfaction in work life, for example. Yes, who women tend to experience a lot more satisfaction in work life than men. And actually, in the quality of life literature, this has become known as the paradox of the contented female worker. And it's paradox because much data show that women are discriminated against at work. And as such, one would assume that this discrimination should lead to dissatisfaction, not satisfaction. So, one explanation of the paradox involves occupational sex segregation. Most women tend to work in women type occupations that make them evaluate their work conditions in relation to other women, not men. Doing so reduces perceptions of gender inequity and discrimination. Conversely, women who have occupations dominated by men uh, are promoted dominated by men are promoted are no, I'm not promoted, I'm sorry, are prompted to compare themselves with men, thus making themselves dissatisfied with their jobs. Studies also looked at income adequacy and financial resources. Apparently that makes quite a difference in women's happiness. So if women who make enough money to take care of their family, especially in single family households, yes, that definitely takes a toll on happiness. Also, research shows that women who experience what you call career momentum tend to be much more satisfied than women who work just to make money and support their family. So again, there is a significant difference there. Um, Another set of studies looked at sexual behavior at work, and you know, as in, for example, what do we mean by sexual behavior at work? Would be things like sexual jokes and sexual propositions and possibly sexual harassment. And the studies have, you know, um, consistently shown that exposure to sexual behavior at work is associated with Negative employee work and psychological well-being for especially for women. Okay, finally we have the residential factors. Oh, not finally, that the residential factors. Um, and one, I'm looking at one particular study that looked at community relocation, and that is when women move from one community to another, how does that affect their psychological well-being or happiness? And the answer is, well, it depends. It depends on what this study have identified as push versus pull factors, and the idea that is the discrepancy between push and pull factors um, in relocation decisions is the thing that really affects psychological well-being, and that is the higher the discrepancy between push and pull factors lowers psychological well-being. So what are push and pull factors? Well, um, examples of push factors would include psychological, I mean, physical health problems, death of a husband, loss of friends and neighbors nearby, lack of access to activities, and excessive cost of home maintenance. Examples of pull factors would include provision of on-site healthcare services, closer proximity to family, availability of friends in the new home, opportunities to engage in new activity, etc. So again, the idea is that the greater the discrepancy between what you call push and pull factors, the lower the subjective well-being. Another residential factor is crime in the community, and many studies have looked into that. And yes, the finding is pretty robust in the sense that women tend to be affected by crime in the community a lot more than men. Um, and so, of course, the higher the perception of crime in the community, the lower the subjective well-being of women. Okay, moving right along to sexual and relationship factors. We've got sexual satisfaction. So let's start with sexual satisfaction. Women are much more satisfied sexually speaking, tend to experience higher level of subjective well-being. Sexual satisfaction does make a difference among women. But the study that I'm looking at, again, didn't compare necessarily women versus men. We're talking about women who experience higher levels of sexual satisfaction tend to experience higher levels of subjective well-being. Okay. Um, Ethnic groups. Okay. Now, there's one particular study that looked at women who are white versus African American in the United States. So again, we're talking about white versus black, and and again, the supposition is that black women tend to be a little bit more uh, sexual in the sense that they enjoy their sexuality, feel much more comfortable with their sexuality. White women tend to be much more conservative and 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 um, and, and anxiety prone when it comes to their own sexuality. And yes, apparently there is some evidence to suggest that black women tend to feel much more comfortable with with their own identity, their own sexual identity, and feel much more comfortable in their own skin, so to speak. Um, and they enjoy sex a lot more than white women, and that sexual satisfaction transfers or spills over to life satisfaction. Then we have pregnancy and childbirth. Um, the research shows that marital and parental well-being declines after childbirth because of the stresses and strains placed on the mother in caring for the child. Um, when it comes to child childbearing on mother's life satisfaction, well, the research shows a positive association. That is, childbearing has a persistent positive effect on mother's overall happiness, particularly with the firstborn child. Additional children may reduce mother's overall level of happiness. How about romantic relationships? Again, if it is a happy romantic relationship, then that contributes quite a bit to subjective well-being. So life satisfaction correlates strongly, especially over time, with relationship satisfaction. Okay. Health-related factors. We got eating disorders and social support. Eating disorders. Well, eating disorders seem to be an important factor in young women's quality of life. Um, so, yeah, so those women who experience eating disorders scored lower on subjective well-being. And again, when it comes to social support, it says when women become sick, the kind of when they receive social support from others within a healthcare context, they their level of subjective well-being is uh, is correspondingly affected, meaning that again those people who receive high level of social support um, tend to register a higher level of subjective well-being. Finally, we have factors related to the feminist movement, uh, and research shows that feminist attitudes is a factor in women's increased sense of well-being. Um, Also, we have, those women who identify themselves as feminists feel more comfortable and they experience a higher level of psycho, psychological well-being than those who are much more conservative from that perspective. There are other studies that looked at gender role orientation, and gender role orientation focuses on the distinction between, um, you know, women who are highly feminine versus women who are androgynous, meaning between, well, you got women who are highly feminine or women who are masculine, and then you've got women who are androgynous, meaning, they have both masculine and feminine characteristics. And the research shows that women who tend to be androgynous score the highest levels of subjective well-being than either either the women who are highly masculine or highly feminine. And that concludes this module, and actually that concludes what our own review or overview of the entire book. Well, thank you for watching and listening.